So in this video, I'm going to talk a little bit about Antarctic ecosystems, the unique ecosystems that we find in Antarctica, including some of the really unusual adaptations that life has had to make in order to live in the cold, both beneath the ocean or in the ocean, and also in and around the ice. So there are two main ecosystems in Antarctica. We talk about the marine ecosystem, everything that lives in the ocean, and then the terrestrial ecosystem, everything that lives on land. And both the ecosystems in Antarctica are characteristically quite simple. The marine is very important. It's actually one of the most productive ecosystems on Earth during summer. And it's extremely important in terms of the global carbon cycle and taking up CO2, carbon dioxide and things like that. And that ecosystem is controlled by sea ice. So before I talk about it, what organisms we find, I'll talk just a little bit about the oceanography, how the ocean water masses affect what ecosystems we see. So around Antarctica, we have the Antarctic Circumpolar Current that's thermally isolating Antarctica. It's the biggest current on Earth, moving vast amounts of water. But everything south of that is very cold. So it can be as cold as minus 1.8 degrees centigrade. Seawater freezes at a colder temperature than fresh water because of the salt in it. So it can actually get down to minus 1.8. We can get warmer water, particularly near the coast, where some warmer water masses that are at depth in the ocean, they can upwell to the surface, and they bring with them lots of nutrients, as well as that warmth, which can affect the ice sheet, and I'll talk about in another video on climate change. But they bring up nutrients like carbon and phosphorus and nitrogen and so on that a lot of the organisms need. The sea ice around Antarctica each winter is expanding. It's freezing, so it freezes from seawater, doubling the area of Antarctica in winter. It forms such a big expanse. You can imagine it forms a lid on the ocean, and really all the ecosystem activity tends to occur either at the sea ice edge or in holes in the sea ice, little gaps in the sea ice that we call polynyas, which is a Russian word, polynya. And so it's the sea ice edges which is the focus of lots of the activity in the Southern Ocean food chain and the ecosystem. And indeed, this has been known for a long time. The whalers, that I'll talk about in a moment, they knew to go and look for whales at the sea ice edge. The food chain that exists in that environment around the edge of the sea ice and in the Southern Ocean is very simple. It's one of the simplest on Earth, and it starts off with the phytoplankton. This is the algae and plants living in the surface layers of the ocean, living by photosynthesis. They're fed upon, they're grazed upon by zooplankton, and the most well-known of which and the most important in Antarctica is something called krill. And krill is a little shrimp-like creature, grows a few centimetres long, but it occurs in vast numbers. So you can have swarms of krill that can include billions of animals. So the krill then form the basis of the food chain for an awful lot of other organisms. So you get the penguins, the seals, lots of birds and whales all eat krill. And sitting above all of that, you get a few things like leopard seals and orcas that will feed on penguins and seals, things like that. But the most important part of the ecosystem is the krill, because almost everything above eats the krill. The sea ice around Antarctica each winter is expanding. As it freezes and expands, it's picking up tiny little bits of particulate matter, organic matter that are in the ocean, tiny bits of plankton and little bits of debris, organic debris, and it freezes them into the ice. So when that sea ice starts to melt back in the summer, it's releasing that locked up organic debris as a pulse of nutrients, and that causes a bloom, a huge pulse of activity with all that algae, those phytoplankton blooming. So the krill then bloom, they form in vast numbers. You get these big swarms of krill at the ice edge, and so all the other animals and birds then start feeding at the sea ice edge. So some of the unique adaptations that some of these birds and animals have, some of the invertebrates that live in the ocean, they're adapted to grow very slowly. They can grow very large and get very old. So we see some unusual organisms in the Southern Ocean. The organisms are generally highly evolved to cold temperatures, so they're very sensitive to any changes in temperature, which of course becomes important with climate change. But some of them have even evolved antifreeze in their blood. So some fishes have these natural antifreezes that they've evolved to have to stop them freezing solid. A lot of the marine species that we're familiar with actually breed on land. So we quite often think of seals and penguins as we see them on land. So although they're part of the marine ecosystem, They breed on land, and we see these vast colonies, and so colonies of penguins can reach millions, and they're hugely rich in terms of nutrients and productivity, and they tend to be near where those big concentrations of krill are occurring. When they finish breeding, most of the species will go back into the Southern Ocean. You'll get some, particularly the birds, will migrate much further. The Arctic tern, for example, will head back to Europe. And then, of course, most famously, the one bird that doesn't leave is the emperor penguin. So the emperor penguins, the females lay an egg, and it's the males who stay back over winter, and they brood this egg, which hatches during the winter, during the depths of the Antarctic winter, complete darkness, and they will nurture that chick through the Antarctic winter. You may have seen the footage of these big huddles in the storms, and they will look after the chick until the female returns in the spring, will feed the chick, and the male is then released to go off and feed and to try and regain some of his body weight. So the emperor penguin is probably unique in staying in Antarctica for the winter. The terrestrial ecosystem, so the on-land ecosystem, is even simpler, and the most striking feature is how small everything is. It's very species poor. It's the lowest biodiversity of any continent. And the productivity is really limited by that low temperature, but also, perhaps surprisingly, by the lack of availability of water. Despite being surrounded by snow and ice, not much of it's liquid, and organisms need liquid water. So it's the low water availability can sometimes limit the productivity of the terrestrial ecosystem. And of course, there's not much nutrient cycling except near those seal and penguin colonies, and they're quite often a focus for some of the plants, and smaller animals will actually live near those colonies because of the nutrients. But it's a real contrast to the Arctic, the Antarctic terrestrial ecosystem. So in the Arctic, you can imagine you've got the herbivores, the grazers like the reindeer and the muskox and the Arctic hares and so on, being preyed upon by Arctic foxes, wolves, polar bears. None of that exists in Antarctica. The largest herbivore, the largest grazing animal in Antarctica, is between 1 and 2 millimeters long, called a tardigrade, little water bear. And it just grazes underneath rocks, tiny amounts of lichen and moss and so on. So it's a very different system. And if you can remember, penguins in the south, polar bears in the north, that's a really important thing. There are no polar bears in Antarctica. So the largest herbivore, as I've said, just a millimetre or two long. The other sorts of other things we find we get some mites and nematode worms and a few insects. Most of them are parasites on the birds and seals, but we get some other insects. On the plant side, there's only 2 flowering plants in Antarctica, and the rest are all mosses and lichens. You can actually get lichens within 100 miles or so of the pole. They're incredibly hardy, some of these Antarctic lichens, living on those nunataks close to the pole, surviving 6 months of complete darkness and temperatures down to -50, -60, -70. And a real unusual adaptation in Antarctica is something we call endolithic algae. Endo within, lith, the rock, endolithic algae. And if you break open some rocks in Antarctica, you'll see a little green stripe just a couple of millimeters in from the edge of the rock. And that's an algae that lives inside the rock to shelter itself from the wind and the worst of the cold. And they're some of the furthest south organisms we find in Antarctica, is those endolithic algae. And they all live, all these ecosystems in the terrestrial, all these organisms in the terrestrial ecosystem live very close to the surface. They don't live more than a centimetre or 2 above the surface, because as you get higher up, the windier and colder it gets. And actually it can be quite a few degrees warmer right near the surface than at human head height, for example. So they tend to live in that surface layer where it's much, much warmer. The lack of water availability can be the biggest constraint, and it's very common, in fact, to see most of the plant life, the mosses and the plants and the grasses, starting to grow around melting snow patches in spring, because they're so limited by this water availability. They have to go somewhere where they can get liquid water. You might think that the Antarctic ecosystem is pristine and undisturbed because it's so remote, but that's actually not true. It's one of the most disrupted ecosystems on the planet. And that started a long time ago. In the 1770s, Captain James Cook was on his voyages of exploration, and he discovered an island, one of the sub-Antarctic islands, and commented in his journals at how many seals were on the beaches. And within a few years, the seal hunters had arrived and were taking seals in vast numbers. And in fact, they took millions of them for fur and for oil. And one species, the Antarctic fur seal, was nearly made extinct, very nearly made extinct. That was closely followed by whaling, when the whalers went into the Southern Ocean and started taking the great whales, the blue whales, the fin whales, the sei whales, and the humpbacks, along with some others. And that was quite close to the coast to start with, so they were taking large numbers, but there were large areas of the Southern Ocean untouched. But actually in the 1920s, they invented factory ships. The whaling industry invented factory ships, which allowed them to go whaling everywhere. So they had catcher ships, which would bring the dead whales back to the factory ship for processing. And after the 1920s, in just a few decades, in some cases, about 98% of the whales were killed by the whalers. So the blue whale very, very nearly went extinct. Fortunately, commercial whaling was eventually banned. There's a tiny bit of scientific whaling, so-called scientific whaling is still carried out by Japan in the Southern Ocean, but no other nation does any whaling in Antarctica. And there are promising signs that the ecosystem is recovering. There's encouraging signs around islands where they used to be hunted and now being seen in larger numbers every year. So very encouraging signs that the ecosystem is recovering. So just in summary then, if you were trying to look at an ecosystem in Antarctica, if you were in the coastal waters or the coastal areas of Antarctica, I beg your pardon, you might see penguin and seal colonies, you see lots of mosses, you might see some seabirds, busy and productive. If you were further inland, you would just see a few lichens, those endolithic algae, and maybe an occasional bird like a petrel or a skua. And if you're further offshore, you might see those blooms around the sea ice edge with the krill and lots of seals and penguins and whales feeding on them. So I'll talk in a later video actually about how the continent is governed and managed, including how actually fishing and some other commercial activity with the ecosystems takes place.